You are playing your deck wrong! Yes, you heard that right. 99% of players have no clue how to actually play their own deck. Why? Because they don't understand their deck's strategy. You see, there are a total of 6 deck strategies in Clash Royale. And in this video, I'm going to give you 5 pro tips for every single one of them. Bait. Bait decks rely on baiting out your opponent's spells through various other spam cards so that your Goblin Barrel or Skeleton Barrel can get damage. These decks are not that expensive and rely on outsmarting your opponent. So here are 5 most important tips if you want to get better at the bait archetype. Always princess the opposite lane to your weak tower. This is really necessary because of 2 reasons. First of all, you want to avoid a counter push towards your weak tower at all costs. Let's say you deploy the princess at the bridge in the same lane as your weak tower. Your opponent uses a knight to defend. Now, he has a mini tank in the same lane as your weak tower and can build a counterattack. This can be tough for you to defend as you're already down 3 elixir. The second reason is that with lockbait decks, you need to split up your damage mostly. This way, you can really confuse your opponent when you use your evolved Goblin Barrel later on and get a lot of damage. While this tip is helpful, it can become useless if you don't take tip number 5 into account. I'll get to that in a minute, but first, let me tell you a tip that seems simple, but almost no one follows it. Make sure that you know your ideal way to win a particular match. Against some decks, it might be impossible to break through with a Goblin Barrel. Maybe your opponent is running triple spells or something. In those matches, you should focus more on defense and then use rockets in double and triple elixir to spell cycle your way to victory. Try to also get some sneaky princess damage whenever you can. While getting damage from the Goblin Barrel can be difficult against certain matchups, the next tip can actually increase your chances of getting damage. Always switch up your Goblin Barrel placements depending on their counters. Recognize early on what your opponent's best counters to your Goblin Barrel are. If they are using a Bob Barrel, try to deploy your barrels to the sides of the tower every now and then. If they're using a log, deploying your Goblin Barrel way in the back can be a good choice. Similarly, if they have a splash damage dealing card for your barrel, then always use the classic placement. But you see, your Goblin Barrels will only get damage if you don't get into negative elixir trades, so let me tell you a tip to avoid getting into such trades. Never deploy your princess and goblin gang together. This may sound simple, but to this day, a ridiculous number of players still make this mistake. If your opponent has a small spell, you're giving them a huge positive trade. Imagine your opponent using a log on your princess plus goblin gang. 2 elixir for 6! That's a negative 4 elixir trade for you, so don't make this dumb play ever unless you're sure that there's no way your opponent can extract a positive trade out of it. Never princess at the bridge if you don't have cheap responses to what your opponent will use to counter her. You need to figure out what your opponent is using to counter your princess. If it's something that can lead you into a negative elixir trade, then avoid using your princess at the bridge for the most part. For example, let's say you deploy your princess. Your opponent uses a Ram Rider to counter her. Now, if you don't have a cheap response like cannon, you're mostly cooked, because now you have to overspend to defend the Ram Rider. If you waste more than 3 elixir to defend her, you're putting yourself in a big negative elixir trade. So, in order to win, you only need to do 2 things. First is to avoid bad elixir trades, and second is to hit that like and subscribe button. Cycle. Cycle decks are cheap and rely on outcycling your opponent's counters to your win condition. They have light but reliable defense, and you need to be really precise with your plays. So if you want to dominate using cycle decks, these are 5 pro tips you need to follow. Pay attention to the order you cycle your cards. This is a really important tip because most of the time you will only have 1 or 2 counters to your opponent's win condition. So you need to cycle those counters first before playing any other card so that you can get them back in hand sooner. Consider this as an example. Hog EQ versus Lava Hound. Let's say your opponent drops a Lava Hound in the back. You go in the opposite lane with your Hog Rider and Log and save your Firecracker for the Lava Hound. But as soon as you drop your Firecracker, your opponent nukes her with arrows. Now you have nothing to defend the Lava Hound and need to cycle 4 cards to get back to your Firecracker. But wait, let's replay this scenario. This time, when your opponent drops a Lava Hound, you play your Firecracker first, and then go in the opposite lane with a Hog Rider plus Log. Now, even if your opponent drops arrows on the first Firecracker, You only need to cycle 2 more cards to get her back in hand, and your opponent won't be able to counter her this time. Therefore, you need to cycle your cards efficiently, especially the ones which pose a threat to your opponent. Knowing when to cycle your win condition is a tough task though. But thankfully, the next tip covers that. Try to play your win condition in the opposite lane if your opponent drops something in the back when they hit 10 elixir. This is especially useful when they drop something like a 3 or 4 elixir card in the back. Because they used that elixir already, they won't have much to defend your win condition and will likely have to spend more and more elixir. This will get them low on elixir and they won't be able to make a good push, for which they dropped a card in the back in the first place. But you, on the other hand, will not only neutralize their push but also gain damage in the other lane. Gaining damage in 2 different lanes is important. And the next tip explains basically that. Don't be afraid to switch lanes even if you're high on damage in one lane. This heavily applies to when you're facing a beatdown deck. You should never push into the same lane as a beatdown deck unless you're certain you can finish off the game. If you push into the same lane against a beatdown deck, you'll basically help them build a huge counterattack. But pushing into the other lane as their tank makes them spend elixir to deal with your threat. And because they will have to spend elixir for that, they won't have much elixir to support their beatdown push. This will help make your defense much easier. But if you want to have a picture-perfect defense, you need to follow this next tip. Pull troops in the middle as much as you can. You don't have very high damage dealing cards in cycle decks. Your cards will be mostly cheap and fragile. Therefore, while defending your opponent's attack, it becomes really necessary that you pull their troops in the middle. This way, both your towers can target those troops and finish them faster. Once you're done with defense, try breaking through on offense. And to help you with that, we have our final yet most important tip. Read your opponent's defensive patterns. The best thing about cycle decks is that you get a lot more offensive pushes as compared to something like beatdown or control decks. So early game, try to read your opponent's patterns in which they try to defend against your push. Then, once you're certain they're doing the same thing again and again, drop a prediction play on them. So, for example, if your opponent is constantly defending your Hog Rider with barbarians, a prediction fireball on the barbs will instantly win you the game. Recognize patterns and play accordingly. Beatdown. Beatdown decks are the heaviest decks in the game. They rely on building a huge push behind a tank card and overwhelming your opponent. These decks are slow-paced and require trading tower damage to gain an elixir advantage. If you want to become a master of beatdown decks, you need to follow these 5 tips. Play your tank if your opponent wastes a 3 elixir card or more in the back. This is really necessary because you don't want to feed elixir to your opponent by playing your support cards without a tank. Imagine if they drop a P.E.K.K.A. in the back. Will you drop a Lumberjack or Baby Dragon in the same lane? No, right? Instead, what you should do is place your tank in the back and build a huge push behind it. That way, your support troops will be tanked for and can take out your opponent's units without getting destroyed themselves. This tip is equally important as the next one when dealing against cycle decks. Don't hesitate to tower trade against cycle decks. If you find an opportunity where you can actually tower trade against a cycle deck, then always take it. Tower trading against a cycle deck really puts the odds in your favor because it opens up the pocket. Since buildings are mostly always placed in the pocket, this allows you to destroy them quickly since you can place troops directly on top of the building once the pocket is opened. Don't ignore your opponent's push totally. Instead, try to defend it lightly. Gone are the days when you could totally ignore your opponent's push if they try to punish you and still win. Nowadays, if you try to ignore their push, not only will you lose your tower, but also you'll be shocked to see how easily they might be able to defend your push. So yeah, if your opponent tries to punish you for playing a tank, try to defend cheaply. For example, if you go golem in the back and your opponent punishes you with royal hogs, you can just play your bomber to defend. You will take some damage, but at least you won't lose your tower. But what if you're facing a beatdown deck instead? Don't worry, I've got a tip for that too. If you're facing a less heavier beatdown deck than yours, always go in the same lane as them. Your cards are stronger, tankier, and probably deal more damage. Therefore, it'll make sense for you to go in the same lane as their tank. Their tank will die first, and your own tank will still be alive, thus allowing for a big counter push. For example, if you're facing Giant while playing Golem, you know that your tank has more hit points, so destroy their Giant quickly, and your troops can attack behind your Golem, who will still have some HP left. Don't play your win condition if you can't support it properly. This should be a no-brainer, but if you can't support your tank properly, you might as well wait to make a push. Otherwise, your offense will be weak and you'll basically be feeding elixir to your opponent. The counter push will be crazy and you would lose the game in an instant. Siege! Siege decks feature the Expo and Mortar, the only two buildings that can get damage on your opponent's towers from your side of the arena. These decks are fast, have a ton of defensive potential, and require outcycling your opponent's counters. Siege decks are a bit tough to play, but these 5 tips will help you master this archetype in no time. Figure out your opponent's counters to your siege building right away. Early on in the match, the first thing you need to do is figure out what cards counter your siege building. Then, during the whole match, your job is to outcycle those cards so that your Expo or Mortar can get a tower connection. For example, if you know that your opponent is running a Giant to counter your Expo, you need to try to outcycle their Giant and go all in on offense as soon as it happens. If you can't break through, spell cycle! Some matchups are really impossible for siege decks. Matchups like Royal Giant or Royal Recruits can be really tough for Expo, so if you know you're facing a hard counter, focus on defending perfectly throughout the match. Then, once triple elixir hits, you can start spell cycling your opponent. Your fireballs or rockets will continue getting tower damage, while your opponent won't be able to break through your flawless defense. Good defense is the better offense with Siege. The biggest quality of Siege decks is that they have the strongest defense out of any deck in the game. If you decide to defend all game and your defense is picture perfect, there's basically nothing your opponent can do. Once your opponent recognizes that you have a strong defense, they will likely spend more elixir on their push to break through. This is a fatal mistake, as siege decks can defend high elixir pushes for much less. Your job is to force out this mistake from your opponent. Defend so well that it frustrates your opponent, and once they overcommit on offense and are low on elixir, go all in on offense with your Expo or Mortar. Change lanes according to your opponent's spells. If your opponent is running a big spell like Lightning, Poison, or Earthquake, always go in the opposite lane to the lane they are trying to get damage in. Because if you go in the same lane as them, they will always drop their spells on both your siege building and tower together and get free damage. Not only will your Expo not get a lock, your tower's HP will slowly keep on reducing, so always push in the lane of your stronger tower. But if your opponent doesn't have a proper big spell, it makes much more sense to push in the same lane as them. Learn anti-spell placements for your buildings. While defending, opt for placements where your opponent can't drop a spell on your Expo. For example, this is the anti-fireball placement. And if you place your Expo right here, your opponent can't use a lightning on it. Similarly, if you're running a Tesla in your siege deck, you should know where to place it to avoid spells like Earthquake or Fireball. Force your opponent to choose whether to drop a spell on your tower or your building. Bridge Spam! Bridge Spam is a highly aggressive archetype. You will mostly use offensive cards in these decks. Your job is to keep forcing your opponent into bad elixir trades by applying a lot of pressure on offense. Use these 5 tips to understand how exactly to pressure with Bridge Spam decks. It is very important to figure out the counters your opponent has for your spam cards. Once you figure out their counters, try to play around those. You need to bait them into using that counter for something else other than your win condition, and once they use it, you can apply tremendous amounts of pressure. For example, if your opponent is running only a mini P.E.K.K.A. to counter your battle ram, perhaps try baiting it out with a bandit or royal ghost. If your opponent uses the mini tank to counter those, they won't have much to defend your battle ram. Figure out the problem card for your opponent. Here's an important thing to know about Bridge Spam. These decks are designed in such a way that you will always have a card that your opponents will have trouble dealing against. This can be a win condition, defensive card, or spell. no matter what your opponent is playing, there will always be a card that will give them a frustrating time. Figure out what card it is and try to extract the maximum value out of it. For example, if you know your opponent can't defend your Inferno Dragon, then your job is to protect it at all costs and let it destroy your opponent's push. Don't underestimate the power of a good counter push. While the name of the deck suggests that you have to spam cards at the bridge, there are some matchups where you will need to defend first and then attack. Building a huge counter push or utilizing your surviving troops to pressure in both lanes can be a key to victory. So don't just spam your cards recklessly on the bridge. Instead, try to defend and rely on a counter push to win. Figure out that one game-winning push. Regardless of your deck face, there will exist one type of push that will win you the game. You need to find that combo. For example, if you're playing P.E.K.K.A bridge spam against a Golem player, then the ideal push will be a battle ram behind a P.E.K.K.A on the bridge. This is a very tough push to defend for beatdown users, since the P.E.K.K.A literally counters mostly all support cards. And, well, obviously, their Golem won't start throwing rocks at your push. So whatever deck you're playing against, figure out the right combination of your cards which you can use to win the game. Know your matchups. Bridge spam heavily relies on getting positive elixir trades on offense to win. While spamming cards on the bridge will help you get these trades, you need to know that sometimes games are won by building a push from the back. So don't hesitate to start your push from behind your tower rather than the bridge. This way, you will have more elixir to build a huge push which can overwhelm your opponent. Control! Control decks require patience as they rely on building a huge counter push. You will always need to defend first with these decks and then go all in on offense with your surviving troops. If you think you have the patience to play control decks, then these 5 tips will take your gameplay to the next level. Space out your defensive troops smartly. Just because you have great defensive units doesn't mean you can deploy them literally anywhere. You need to avoid giving spell value to your opponent, because if you don't, your defense can crumble quickly. So space out your troops so that your opponent can't hit all of them. Force them to make a choice as to which troop or building should they drop their spell on. Play reactively to your opponent. Defend according to what your opponent is deploying. For example, if they deploy a Lava Hound plus Balloon, you can use a Baby Dragon plus Ice Wizard plus Tornado to counter the whole push. But if they drop a Lava Hound plus Miner next time, you don't need the exact same combination as before. Use your mini tank like Knight or Valkyrie to counter the Miner, and have your Baby Dragon counter the Lava Hound. Keep changing your defensive patterns so that you don't become too predictable with them. Sometimes you don't even need your win condition to actually win. If you're facing a matchup where you have an unbreakable defense, then there is absolutely no need to use your win condition. Be patient, defend all game, and then spell cycle in the end. A good example would be Graveyard Control versus Bridge Spam. If you defend all game, there's absolutely no way they're gonna break through. But wasting 5 elixir on a Graveyard might give them a huge counter push, which can lose you the game. So once again, be patient. Winning is more important than a few quick crowns. Against beatdown decks, if you know that they don't have good answers to your Graveyard, you're allowed to overpush a little on offense. Since control decks are good at defending beatdown pushes, your opponent can hardly ever get damage. But on the other hand, a single Graveyard can destroy their entire tower. You can spend a bit more elixir on offense and still get away with it, because your poison and other defensive cards won't even let your opponent get any damage. Always prioritize defense first. Control decks are all about patience, so always focus on defending patiently rather than spamming your win condition like a noob. Defend well, then build a big counter push using your surviving troops and combine them with your win condition. While these tips are necessary if you're playing a certain deck strategy, what's even more important is that you learn how to counter each one of them. And for that, YouTube thinks this is the perfect video for you.